Before Khalil Rountree was regarded as one of the top light heavyweights in the MMA world, and before he put everything on the line against the juggernaut that is Alex Pereira in his brutal quest for UFC gold, his life could not have been more different and difficult. Rountree spent most of his childhood as a severely obese recluse, targeted by bullies at high school who decimated his confidence. This video tells the remarkable story of Khalil Rountree's improbable rise to top UFC light heavyweight contender, and all of the obstacles he faced on his epic journey from staring at an early grave to going life and death with the best fighter in the world. Let's get into the video. The story of Khalil Rountree Jr. began with a tragedy that took place before he was even old enough to understand what was happening. But the impacts of this incident would be one felt for the remainder of his life. Khalil's father, who was the road manager for various musical acts including Boyz II Men, was tragically killed by thieves trying to steal his jewelry while on tour in Chicago when Khalil Jr. was just 2 years old.
They found out where his hotel room was and ended up getting him to come out of his hotel room, and they got into a fight. My dad's trying to defend himself against a few guys, and one of them ended up having a gun. Little did they know, yeah, they might have wanted to take, his things, but they took a good dude who worked hard to make the world a better place.
The only memories Khalil had of his father was being tossed in the air as a kid in Los Angeles, and he would spend his childhood hearing about the great man his father was, knowing that he'd never get to meet him. Looking back on his childhood, Khalil Jr. would reflect that the lack of a strong father figure was a key factor in some of the issues that would plague his life into adulthood. Although his father was gone, Khalil Jr. did inherit his father's love of music, and he developed a diverse taste at an early age, even having a goth phase and blasting heavy metal. Unfortunately, these eccentricities made him stick out early on in high school, and he was targeted heavily by school bullies for being different.
Shab told you about it, but going from this kid who was just super overweight my whole life, never fit in with anybody. I was always just this introverted, gothic, weird kid that nobody ever talked to.
This rejection by his peers would cause Khalil to withdraw from the world and stop interacting with people to try and avoid confrontation and more mockery, laying the foundation for teenage years dominated by isolation and escapism, with music one of the only things powerful enough to draw him into the world to play as part of various bands. This bullying and failure to find friends led to Khalil self-destructing in dramatic fashion, with comfort sought in the form of junk food, and before long, a teenage Khalil Rountree ballooned up in weight, damaging his self-confidence even further. As if the food wasn't enough, he also took up smoking and eventually began dabbling heavily in alcohol to try and escape his miserable existence, all still while just a teenager. Khalil Rountree would describe these as the worst years of his entire life, as he was heading down a dark and desperate path with seemingly no light at the end of the tunnel.
Extra cash, but I got to a point where I was very, very depressed.
Yeah.
Suicidal, I just didn't see the meaning of life.
Yeah.
I didn't see, why am I alive? What am I even doing?
Yeah.
His weight would eventually top out at an astonishing 305 pounds by the time he was 19 years old, and his health was in such an awful state that even at such a young age, he suffered a serious health scare.
And then by 19, I got up to 305 pounds. 19 years old. And I remember one night laying down to go to bed, and I just felt my heart pumping ridiculously. And I was just like, no way. This is I think I'm going to die. And I woke up in a panic. And
this scary experience was the wake-up call Khalil needed to begin searching for avenues to turn his life around. But he remained directionless, and he didn't know how to pull himself out of the mess that he'd gotten himself into. The loss and absence of his father had been felt in moments just like this, but when he needed it the most, it was a family member that was the one to come to his rescue, with his older brother seeing the struggle Khalil was going through. His older brother was leading a very different life to Khalil, a life that had seen him take up martial arts and train Muay Thai. Knowing how training made him feel, he decided to try and convince Khalil Jr. to try a Muay Thai class with him, and after showing him some episodes of The Ultimate Fighter, he succeeded in convincing his younger brother to try just one class, with Khalil seeing the life-changing impact that the sport had for others through The Ultimate Fighter.
When we started watching The Ultimate Fighter, we started to see that there were guys on that show that had similar backgrounds and stories to us.
Yeah.
You know, we were like, I can relate with this guy. You mean to tell me that all he did was he had to just fight, and now he's gonna be on this show and then could potentially fight again and then have like a future and a life?
Ooh.
Little did his brother know at the time just how impactful this one decision would end up being for the trajectory of Khalil Rountree Jr.'s life. Despite rocking up to his first Muay Thai class at over 300 pounds, the very first kick of the pad was all Khalil needed to be hooked on Muay Thai. That one session had been enough to spark a new lifelong passion for Khalil, and it changed everything. Morbidly obese and unable to work out for more than a few minutes at a time before needing rest, a potential career in mixed martial arts was the furthest thing from his mind. But training Muay Thai made him feel good in a way that he hadn't felt in a long time, so he kept showing up for training. For now, Muay Thai was just a fun hobby with a side effect of weight loss, but that would all change when he attended a local MMA fight card with his brother. Just like watching The Ultimate Fighter, going and seeing an MMA fight in person added more fuel to the fire-powering the changes in his life, with Rountree enchanted by the fights and feeling an unshakable desire to do whatever it took to one day step inside the cage and have a fight of his own. At this point, Rountree Jr. was just a couple of months into his Muay Thai training, and he was still extremely overweight. So when he asked his coach to find him a fight, the answer was a predictable no. But it wasn't a firm no. His coach issued him a challenge: lose 100 pounds and I will find you the fight that you're looking for. And that was all Khalil Rountree needed to hear. He began working harder than ever before and took steps to improve his awful diet. And before long, the weight was rapidly falling off him, revealing a muscular physique that had been hiding under the layers of fat. The impact for Rountree was completely life-changing. From an obese, scared, shy individual who never left his bedroom, he became a new person, slowly gaining confidence and feeling more alive than he had ever felt in his life, while chasing down his goal of having his first ever MMA fight. And as his weight ticked down closer to the goal of 205 pounds, the idea of a fight moved from a fantasy to a reality, with Khalil's first fight booked in the first steps on an unbelievable journey to the top of mixed martial arts. The transformation Rountree had undergone through his countless hours training Muay Thai was a dramatic one, and by the time he made the walk to the cage for his first fight, he was unrecognizable from the 300-pound bedroom dweller that he used to be. With his weight gone and his confidence lifted, his coach made good on his promise, and the first amateur bout of Rountree Jr.'s MMA career was arranged. With no plans for a professional career, Rountree stepped into the cage for what could have been the one and only time in his life. Instead, he got a life-changing experience.
Yeah.
So after 11 months of training, I lost 100 pounds.
Damn.
And the coaches found me an amateur fight, and
How was that?
TKO first round, 18 seconds, like ref stoppage. And
What
my
was it?
whole family was there,
Yeah.
you know, and I was like, what? Like,
You're cheering for
you're
me?
you know, I was like,
Rountree dived headfirst into fighting, competing 7 times in 2 years in the amateur MMA ranks, picking up 6 wins to just 1 defeat. He flashed strong potential and knockout power with a 16-second KO in his second ever fight, and another finish in less than 2 minutes against a fellow amateur who had a 5-0 record at the time of their fight. The next step was an obvious one, and in 2014, Rountree Jr. officially made the move to professional MMA, eager to see if he had what it took to build a career in the world's most brutal sport, and with a singular goal in his mind. Watching The Ultimate Fighter with his brother had inspired him to take the first step into the Muay Thai gym, and now he was chasing his own spot on the show that had changed the course of his life. His first fights in the professional ranks would come for Resurrection Fighting Alliance, and Rountree made light work of his competition, quickly jumping out to a 3-0 professional record in less than 1 year. The potential was now obvious, and even at this early stage, the UFC was sitting up and taking notice, with Rountree Jr. told that one more win against a decent opponent would be enough to secure him the Ultimate Fighter spot he was chasing. And the decent opponent he needed came in the form of Justin Pelende, a 7-2 fighter who was surging on the back of 6 straight victories, bringing significantly more experience to the fight than Rountree. If Rountree wasn't expecting an easy night, then he was sorely mistaken, as his eagerness to impress saw him get caught by an uppercut that stunned him briefly and dragged him into an absolute war of a first round. But Rountree was no stranger to adversity, and after hanging in there, he would brutally stop the show with a savage knockout of Pelende, flashing his elite level power and earning his shot on the Ultimate Fighter with style. The fact his opponent in Pelende would never fight again perhaps gives us an indication of just how hard Rountree was capable of punching. With his record at 4-0, the UFC would follow through on their promise, and Rountree Jr. was announced as one of the fighters for the 23rd season of The Ultimate Fighter, competing in the light heavyweight division and realizing his goal of appearing on the show absurdly fast. His goal now was to earn a UFC contract and forge a career in the octagon, but the road to the UFC is rarely an unblemished one. Rountree would debut impressively on the show by winning his first fight against Mohamed Daris in the second round by TKO, but his inexperience would show as he would come unstuck in the quarterfinal against Corey Hendricks, ending his run. He'd done amazing to make it this far so fast, especially given the state his life had once been in, but his journey on The Ultimate Fighter had come to an end. He had 5 weeks left in the Tough House and decided to use his time there as an extended training camp, getting ready to rebuild his career and earn another shot at making it to the UFC. But fortune would smile on him, and he wouldn't even need to leave the Tough House before getting another shot, as his quarterfinal opponent in Corey Hendricks was too injured to take part in his semi-final. Dana White would make the call to give Khalil Rountree the fight instead, with Rountree receiving the news of his second chance on his 26th birthday, the perfect gift. This was a second chance Rountree took with both hands, beating Josh Stansbury by TKO in the semi-final and booking himself a spot on the all-important Tough Season finale. A win would have secured Rountree Jr. the UFC contract he was after, but it wasn't his night, as Sanchez used his wrestling to absolutely dominate the fight, highlighting just how much further Rountree Jr. had to climb to ever reach the elite levels of this game. But losing in the tough finale doesn't automatically mean that the UFC is done with you, and Rountree Jr. had actually shown enough that the UFC made the decision to offer him the contract he wanted. It was a fortuitous way to get into the UFC, given that he'd lost the quarterfinal and lost the finale, but if you arrive in the UFC and prove you belong, will anyone really remember that you were lucky to get in? Well, it didn't quite prove to be that simple for Rountree. Nobody could dispute the transformation Rountree Jr. had undergone to get himself in the shape needed for him to even consider an MMA career. But there was an uncomfortable truth about Khalil's career, and it was a truth that he was not yet ready to confront. This uncomfortable truth was that Rountree Jr. was not working anywhere near as hard as he could, and he was relying far too much on his natural gifts to carry him through the challenges he was facing. He had been gifted with great athleticism, good power, and he loved Muay Thai, but there is much more to MMA than just loving Muay Thai, and Rountree Jr. was guilty of skipping the work needed for him to build the toolset of a truly elite MMA fighter. And this was laziness that would plague his career, to the point many wrote him off as a UFC journeyman. His issues with his ground game had already been exposed in his tough quarterfinal and finale defeats. This might have been a wake-up call that doing the bare minimum wasn't going to cut it, but the fact he'd still gotten a UFC contract despite losing those fights, perhaps in his mind it justified that he was on the right path after all. The first fight of his UFC contract was booked against Tyson Pedro, a fellow UFC debutant sporting an unbeaten record, with the fight taking place in Pedro's home country of Australia. And this fight perfectly encapsulated the work Rountree needed to do, as he flashed his natural power to drop Pedro in round 1, but was quickly taken down just 5 seconds later, with Pedro controlling him for the rest of the round before locking in a rear naked choke to secure the victory with a minute to spare in the first round. Rountree never looked like he was comfortable on the mat, and it clearly showed. After this frustrating fight, Rountree bounced back with 2 impressive first round stoppage wins, but these fights were themselves frustrating because it showed just how tangible the potential of Rountree was if he could just get his act together. The knockout of Daniel Jolly in particular, after just 1 minute of their fight, flashed the tantalizing KO power that he possessed, and his TKO victory over Paul Craig, who would himself become a decent light heavyweight contender, showed the levels Khalil was capable of hanging at, even while still not fully committing himself to giving everything to MMA. Despite these impressive results, Rountree followed them up with a frustrating 30-27 loss to 22-year-old Michal Oleksiejczuk, a fight he was widely expected to win. This disappointment was amplified as he wasn't beaten on the ground this time, but instead outstruck, with his lack of conditioning leaving him gassed early in the fight. Though this fight was later overturned to a no contest due to Oleksiejczuk failing a USADA drugs test, it did little to change the perception of Rountree as a middling fighter unlikely to charge his way to the top of the division. An amazing round 1 knockout over kickboxing legend Gokhan Saki was the perfect bounce back performance, and it earned him a Performance of the Night bonus and a chance to turn the page on his career. But his next fight would provide him the wake-up call he so desperately needed to really fulfill his potential. Soon after knocking out Saki, Rountree faced off with Johnny Walker, a UFC debutant riding a 6-fight win streak. Rountree's UFC experience saw him walk to the cage as the betting favourite, but he left the octagon unconscious thanks to a vicious first-round elbow from Walker. At this point, the verdict on Khalil Rountree was out. He was a decent fighter, but not a great one, and he was not a guy ever expected to reach the upper echelons of the light heavyweight division. His UFC record of 3 wins and 3 losses perfectly underlined his status in the company. A middling fighter sitting outside the rankings looking in. Reaching the UFC is an incredible achievement, especially for someone with Rountree's background, and for many that would have been enough. But the Walker loss hit Khalil hard, and for the first time in his career, he was having the honest conversation with himself about whether he was actually committing himself to the levels required to reach greatness. Evaluating his skill set, he realized his stand-up game leaned far too heavily on raw power, while his cardio, striking diversity, and clinch work all needed significant improvements, among many other aspects. His mind was made up, and it was time for a drastic change. Drawing inspiration from the mindset shift that had started his career, Rountree Jr. decided to make a bold decision. He packed his belongings and traveled all the way to Thailand, vowing to overhaul his skills, build a work ethic, and leave no stone unturned in his quest for glory. In behavioral psychology, your environment is seen as a key factor in achieving success. And for Khalil Rountree, living in Las Vegas had served him well to this point, but he was far too comfortable and going through his career on cruise control. But after the crushing loss to Johnny Walker, it became clear that he needed a change in environment to maximize his talent. With the disappointment of yet another defeat acting as fuel, Rountree Jr. would make the radical decision to leave behind the distractions and comfort of home in favor of moving to Thailand to train and fully reevaluate everything about his approach to mixed martial arts. Over the course of his time in Thailand, Rountree immersed himself fully in martial arts. The first fight following his Thailand move suggested that it might pay immediate dividends, as Rountree absolutely demolished Eric Anders with a Muay Thai heavy style. But improvement does not happen overnight, as Rountree was about to find out with a first round loss to Kutalaba to bring an end to 2019. Worse still, his stay in Thailand was ended prematurely by the coronavirus pandemic after just over 2 years, due to the difficulties being caused by travel restrictions.
When I spoke to the Thai immigration, they said, well, if you leave, we don't know when you can come back
Gotcha.
because of COVID.
Yep.
Everything's shut down. If you leave, you leave.
Yep.
Come back whenever,
Yep.
but we can't help you.
Yeah.
So I just was like, okay, well, if I have to leave this place that I love and that I literally want to spend the rest of my life, then I'm going to make it worth something.
Yeah.
It was more than a year since his last fight before Rountree was able to step into the octagon once again. And the resulting loss to Marcin Prachnio, a fighter who was himself on a 3-fight losing skid, begged the question of whether Rountree had truly changed at all, with his results showing no improvement. But as previously mentioned, progress doesn't happen overnight. And while his stint in Thailand hadn't paid off immediately, the principles and lifestyle changes that he'd implemented and brought back with him to the States had laid the foundations for a miraculous career turnaround.
Once I kind of tapped into that like rhythm of how training goes and how the days go and how the Thais are fighting and living, I just kind of like merged in with them and like followed their like rhythm of life. And then I realized like, wow, like this is the best I've ever felt as a fighter, as an athlete, as a human. And I really liked the person that I was becoming, so I did everything I could to hold on to that.
Now living back in Las Vegas and training at Syndicate MMA, Rountree would reveal in interviews that this was the first time in his entire life where he was acting and training like a professional athlete, finally going all in on his career. He was training harder, eating healthier, and had cut off bad influences and stopped going out, revolving his entire life around his craft in the octagon. It hadn't been apparent yet, but this new approach was allowing Rountree to improve significantly, and the UFC was about to start feeling it. With a UFC record of 4 wins to 6 losses and a seeming destiny to spend his career on the outside of the rankings looking in, there was no indicator of what was about to play out. But Rountree was about to make a turnaround as dramatic as the one he'd undergone when losing 100 pounds. The next opponent in his way was Modestas Bukauskas, and with his poor form, Rountree came into this fight as the betting underdog. But he calmly controlled the fight until ending it in the second round, using the dreaded oblique kick to get the finish. A nice victory, but there had been false dawns before with Khalil, but this time was maybe different, as he followed this win up with another impressive performance and win over Khalil Roberson, dropping him and finishing the fight in the second round. The next fight would provide the sternest test yet for the new and improved Khalil Rountree, but he passed this test by the barest possible margins in a razor-thin split decision win that divided opinion between media and fans, with most scoring the fight for his opponent, Dustin Jacoby. But a win is a win, and for the first time in his career, Khalil Rountree had entered the UFC's light heavyweight rankings. If anyone doubted the veracity of the Jacoby win, then there was to be no doubts about his next fight with Chris Daukaus, which ended with a ferocious first-round knockout, propelling Rountree to his 4th win in a row and the number 11 rank in the light heavyweight division. It had taken a long time to get here, but at the age of 33, it now seemed as if he'd finally been able to put everything together, just lacking the signature win to catapult him even further up the rankings. Eyeing a spot inside the top 10, Rountree was handed the opportunity to fight number 8 ranked Anthony Smith after his original opponent Murzakhanov was forced to pull out. Smith brought with him a certain level of pedigree and name recognition, having previously fought for the belt, and given Smith was coming in on short notice to take this fight, this was a gift-wrapped opportunity that Rountree absolutely had to take advantage of. But it wasn't going to be an easy night's work, with Anthony Smith a respected contender capable of hanging in there with almost anyone. Through 2 rounds, Rountree edged ahead using his striking prowess, but he knew he couldn't leave it to the judges or risk a flash knockout. With everything on the line, Rountree delivered a brutal walk-off uppercut in the 3rd round that flattened Smith and extended his win streak to 5 wins in stunning fashion. The UFC now fully recognized Rountree's unignorable momentum, and they granted him a career-defining fight against former champion Jamal Hill, who had been forced to vacate his title. But just weeks before the biggest fight of his career, a bombshell landed. Rountree Jr. had tested positive for PEDs, and the fight with Hill was off. This was a headline that had the potential to torpedo both his title ambitions and his fan base, with Khalil's reputation as a nice, likable guy possibly under threat if he had been caught intentionally cheating. However, Khalil's case was actually much more complicated than it seemed on the surface, as he would go on to explain on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Was working with a company who I outsourced to take care of my supplements and stuff. It was brought to my attention from the owner of the company. He was visiting my house and pointed out something that I was taking and shouldn't have been, but it was sent to me from their company.
The moment Rountree had been informed that he had taken something illegal, he immediately self-reported to the UFC and failed the subsequent drugs test. It was a clear and honest mistake, with the company responsible accepting full liability for their error. But with a failed drugs test, the UFC had no choice but to ban him. Given the cooperation of Rountree and the fact that it was an honest mistake, he was handed a relatively minor 2-month ban. But despite the short length of the ban, he had lost his opportunity to fight Jamal Hill as the co-main event of what was scheduled at the time to be a Conor McGregor card, though McGregor would also pull out for similar but different drug-related reasons. As Rountree was forced to watch from the sidelines, Alex Pereira would ascend to light heavyweight dominance, beating Jamal Hill and Yuri Prochazka. Sitting at the number 8 rank in the division, Rountree was eager to get back into the octagon and continue the momentum that he had been building before his failed drugs test, knowing he was likely one win away from a shot at the title. But when the UFC called to offer him his next fight, the opponent they offered was not the one that he had been expecting, with Rountree offered a shot at the final boss of the light heavyweight division. The decision to offer Rountree this title shot with Alex Pereira was a controversial one, with some sections of the fan base not feeling like he deserved a title shot off the back of beating Anthony Smith, particularly given that the higher-ranked Magomed Ankalaev had a 6-year unbeaten streak and was also available to fight. But no amount of whinging on Reddit was going to change the fight, and after spending his teenage years as an obese, depressed recluse and struggling for years to find his feet in the UFC, Rountree had risen to the top of the division against all the odds. But in his way was a gargantuan challenge, with many predicting that Rountree couldn't even make it out of the first round against someone like Alex Pereira. He would walk to the octagon with some questioning if he belonged at this level of the game. But with nothing to lose, Rountree had everything to gain, and as he stared across the octagon at the stone-faced killer looking back at him, Rountree resolved to leave absolutely everything he had in the cage and fight without fear, as he knew only too well what fear can cost you, with the years he lost hiding from the world as a scared teenager. As round 1 began, the size difference between the pair was obvious, highlighting just how insane it is that Alex Pereira used to fight at middleweight. But Rountree got to work, mixing it up with one of the most gifted strikers to ever set foot in the UFC octagon. He would largely hold his own, but lost the round as Pereira made masterful use of calf kicks and managing distance with his superior reach, forcing Rountree to blitz to close the distance and land anything of significance. Round 2 was much of the same, with Rountree having moments and landing some good shots, but ultimately going down 2-0. His leg was now compromised thanks to the work Pereira had done with his leg kicks, and Rountree's nose was badly busted up. Never renowned for his gas tank, Rountree was already breathing heavily, not helped by the fight taking place at altitude in Salt Lake City. It seemed like round 3 was set up to be the round where Rountree completely fell apart and Pereira would finish the fight, and there wouldn't really be any shame in losing to a fighter as great as Pereira when many expected Rountree to fall in round 1. But instead of falling apart, Rountree bit down on his mouthpiece and tried to take it to Pereira, landing some nice shots including a body kick that backed up the champion. But as the round continued, Pereira re-established his dominance, busting up Rountree's face even more. As the third round ended, the combination of fatigue and damage on Rountree was extremely obvious, and I cannot think of many worse places to be stuck than in an octagon with Alex Pereira in this condition. But game as ever, Rountree headed into the 4th round and refused to give in. Despite taking massive punishment, he still kept swinging and trying to take it to Pereira, even as his efforts seemed futile and his face continued to get brutalized. In the face of Pereira's legendary power, Rountree refused to go down and never stopped trying to fire back, even as his eye was cut wide open. After more than 4 brutal minutes of the 4th round, packed with punishment and with barely the energy to remain standing, Alex Pereira finally sealed the deal with a series of brutal punches to the body that dropped Rountree, with the ref stepping in and ending the fight. Exhausted and battered, Rountree was grappling with the crushing disappointment that he'd lost in the biggest fight of his career, and his quest for gold had unfortunately come up short. But fresh off the heat of battle, he hadn't realized just how inspiring his resilience and determination was to the fans watching. And in reality, despite losing the fight, his stock was actually higher than it had ever been. As an emotional and teary Rountree Jr. made his way backstage, the internet was ablaze with respect and admiration for the bravery that he displayed. And once he'd had time to reflect, Khalil would take pride in knowing that he'd left absolutely nothing in the tank while chasing gold against an all-time great.
I just made a promise to myself and to the fans that like I wasn't going to back down. I was going to give my best fight. So there's pride in being able to, know that I held on to that, to that commitment.
Khalil Rountree Jr. has never been a UFC champion, and there's a chance he never will be. But for a guy like Rountree Jr., no matter how much he wants the belt, winning it will never be the crowning moment of his life. Instead, it will be the journey he underwent and the struggle he overcame to get to the top of the mountain and the people he inspired along the way. And this is an outcome that he seems content with.
But my motivation, obviously I would love to be a champion and just reach the pinnacle of this sport. But if I had to choose between, hey, you can be a champion or you can help countless people's lives, I'd much rather take the lives over the belt any day. Any day.
If you enjoyed the video, drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more, and check out this video on boxing's biggest fake record fraud who rigged his entire career. For football or American football videos, check out my other channels linked below, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.